Okay, I want to start this talk with a quote from a very different thinker than Margarete Susman. And the quote is not about Margarete Susman, but it seems relevant in several ways when thinking about the work of Margarete Susman. And the quote is, "That we should still remember today who this woman was is not self-understood. The renown of a person usually only happens to those who have taken care of it themselves during their lifetime. Those whose name one associates with a certain achievement, whose achievement takes place in a certain historical space that both has a future and a past. Posterity knows the extraordinary, those who are in one way or the other unusual. But posterity only rarely remembers those whose name was related to the fascination of the moment." End of quote. This quote comes from Hannah Arendt. It's an article which was written at the occasion of the 100th anniversary of the German Jewish writer Rahel Varnhagen, whose 100th anniversary was celebrated or remembered on March the 7th in 1933, which is already an ominous period in Germany. In this quote, two things struck me that relate to Margarete Susman. First of all, in order to have an intellectual legacy, it needs authority and attention. It needs to be taken care of, which is something, as history has shown us, women writers are very, very bad at. Margarete Susman was not good at it, fostering her own legacy, rather the opposite. The second aspect concerns Arendt's conclusion, those whose name was related to the fascination of the moment. It can mean two things that are not mutually exclusive. Rahel Varnhagen, about whom Hannah Arendt talks, Rahel Varnhagen was fascinated by her time, and her time was fascinated by Rahel. The same goes for Margarete Susman. What Arendt expresses, however, and that's a problem, is that situational fascination comes with an expiry date. Both in the cases of Rahel Varnhagen and Margarete Susman, the idea of a historically contingent thinking, so that a thinker is only related to her own time and interesting as a historical person, that idea has strongly impacted the importance and the position of their work in the longue durée history of modern critical thinking. I discovered the work of Margarete Susman, who was born in 1872 in Hamburg and died in Zurich in 1966. So she lived a very long life, and I will talk about that a little later too. So I discovered the work of Margarete Susman some 15 years ago, when I was doing research on German writers, intellectuals, and politics in Germany in the first half of the 20th century, related very much to the First World War and the beginning of the Weimar Republic. By coincidence, I came across an article on the state and the individual, the relationship between the state and the individual, and the article was entitled Einzelmoral und Staatsmoral, so the moral, individual morality and state morality. The article had been published in the Frankfurter Zeitung in 1915, so in full war periods, and it was signed M. Susman. So I'd never heard of him, who then turned out to be she. I had been reading a lot of texts by a lot of usual suspects from that period, Thomas Mann, Heinrich Mann, but this very acute and critical and also slightly abstract analysis caught my eye because it was something different. In this reflection on the problem of morality of the individual and the state, at the time when patriotism was the code word, she wrote, quote, "For those who enthusiastically dedicate themselves to their country, the problem of morality is solved actively. For those who look at it, reflect and wonder, für uns aber, die wir hinschauen, denken und fragen, this active solution is only the beginning of its formation in the spirit." Also der Anfang seiner Aufstellung im Geiste. So hinschauen, denken und fragen. It could be used as a characterization of Margarete Susman's oeuvre, of her thinking. However, so hinschauen, watching, thinking, and asking questions, this is what she did her lifetime, but without the burden of the political contemplation or the metaphysical distance she herself had diagnosed as a major problem in cultural history. So she was very critical towards the tradition of German philosophy as living in an abstract world, metaphysics. The same did Franz Rosenzweig. Her own thinking was profoundly guided by high-flown, maybe utopian ideas, ideals even. But in her case, ideas function as signposts for historical change, revolutions even. In her 1919 essay, Die Revolution und die Juden, The Revolution and the Jews, she writes the following, and I'm going to read it in German first and then give you a translation because I want to give you an idea of her very poetic language. Wer an der Idee lebt, der kann das wer an der Idee lebt, der kann das Hingegebene nicht einfach hinnehmen, weil er innerlichst gezwungen ist, alles Bestehende unablässig an ihr zu messen, alles Schlechte, das heißt geistig Erstorbene einzureißen, alles, was der lebendigen Idee sich entgegenstemmt, durch ihr Leben selbst zu sprengen. If one lives with the idea, one cannot take for granted the things as they are, because there is an inner urge to assess everything that exists by the idea, to destroy all evil, and evil is that which is spiritually dead, everything that opposes the living idea by the idea that lives. So this small article on the morality of the state and the individual in the Frankfurter Zeitung from 1915, for me it became like a thread that I started pulling softly over the years to discover, that is too heroic, to kind of become aware of a whole beautifully intricate tapestry, which Barbara Hahn and myself decided we should really be made accessible today. So we've spent years making visible Margarete Susman's work in this curry-colored 5-volume edition that's comprised now more than 3,000 pages. And we thought a lot about the title and then thought gesammelte Schriften, that's neutral. When we think about an oeuvre as a collection of old texts someone wrote during her lifetime, then the gesammelte Schriften are incomplete. In a review of this edition for the Hamburg left-wing journal Konkret in May this year, the journalist Stefan Ripplinger pointed out that there is nothing to reproach this, quote, carefully handled edition, so this is a little self-praise, only that it does not include the letters, the dramas and the poems that Margarete Susman also wrote. That is indeed the case. It would have doubled, probably tripled the size of the edition, and it was simply unfeasible if we wanted to at least have the major part of Susman's critical thinking available today. Stefan Ripplinger writes that he hopes that this edition will lay the foundation for some profound discussions about Margarete Susman's thinking, which he qualifies as very exciting, and then he adds something ominous. Doch diese Denkerin wird so wenig wie zuvor Franz Beermann-Steiner gelesen werden, weil sie, wie zu viel verlangt. So he says, it might be that she will not be read because she is too demanding. And then he adds, no more lonely than she who thinks the whole of the community. Niemand einsamer als die, die das Ganze der Gemeinschaft denkt. The edition of the Gesammelte Schriften received a number of favorable reviews in some major German and Swiss newspapers, all of which were unanimous in their assessment that it was of major importance that Margarete Susman's work regained its place in philosophical and critical discourse. But all these reviews remain very general as to why, or rather what she wrote precisely. This vagueness is comprehensible to some extent, and the problem also applies a little to my presentation of the edition here, which is much more difficult than I thought it would be. Vivian invited me and I said, sure, I'll present the books. And then I thought, who am I presenting? How does one account for 3,000 pages of thinking and writing that were published over more than half a century? And written particularly in that period, as Vivian already mentioned, between 1900 and 1966, in which modern civilization destroyed itself, not once, but twice. Susman herself calls it, quote, a world trampled underfoot and turned numb by the violence of the cruel mass events. Eine von der Gewalt grausamen Massengeschehens überrannten und betäubten Welt. This is a time, she says, that has no parallel to any former period in human history. So what did Margarete Susman write? Who was she? Was she important? To whom was she important and when? To her contemporaries and legacy-wise today? I asked my husband for advice and he said, just tell him what she wrote. That helped. I promised Vivian to highlight Susman's thinking about Judaism, I'm happy to do so, not only because of the context here, because it was an important leitmotif throughout her work. Nonetheless, I want to give you an impression of the spectrum of her thinking too. Of course, you can always single out a certain strand in her work, or different strands. There is certainly enough material. And my take on her is what I want to pursue in my book that I'm planning to write now this year. After the edition of the work, I want to look at how her intellectual life developed. What I want to pursue in my book also, and that has to do with the spectrum of her work, is I want to point out also at the simultaneity of topics she addressed at some point. So she did different things at the same time in unexpected periods. Just to give you an example, in 1943, she was in exile in Switzerland. She wrote two book reviews within a month's time. One book review, and her book reviews, I will explain later, are always extensive essays. So one book review in 1943 was based on a novel, a documentary novel, that evokes the fate of Jewish refugees who were caught at the German-Swiss border. The title of the review is Niemandsland, so it deals with the precarious situation of people who have been ripped out of their civil existence and then find themselves staatenlos, as Hannah Arendt would say, on the border. So that is one review that is then extended into the position or the situation of refugees. And at the same time, she wrote a very interesting analysis of John Steinbeck's novel, The Grapes of Wrath, which addresses the phenomenon of extreme poverty in the United States, the heartland of industry, and then capitalism. So these are two problems she tackled at the same time, or she thinks about at the same time in this broader horizon of modernity. The problem of presenting Susman's collected thinking is not limited, of course, to her work in particular. The same problem arises in the case of someone like Walter Benjamin. I mean, how do you summarize Walter Benjamin? He's as versatile as Susman. So Benjamin and Susman, they both address quite a lot of things, and their spectrum is very wide. Their spectrum of thinking is very wide. In the case of Walter Benjamin, of course, there is much more guidance because the story of his legacy is very different. In the 1950s, a 2-volume edition was supervised by nonetheless than Adorno. Then that was continued by Adorno's pupils, and Walter Benjamin's writings, the edition of his writings has expanded into a project that it will extend until the late 2020s, because I just ordered part of his collected writings, and some of the books of Walter Benjamin will only appear in 2027 or so. So there is a different situation. And what you get with such an extended edition is a better critical apparatus, more unpublished material that was retrieved, and more context to his thinking. This is generally of great importance because editing a work does not mean that you put it in a glass coffin to have it fixed. Rather the opposite. You want to document thinking as a process formed in time, a dynamic that is propelled and happens in exchange with a great many people, some still well known, other people who have totally disappeared. The same happens in the edition of Hannah Arendt. You get more text, more context, more discussing partners, more process thinking. And we try to give it a start with this edition. Now, talking about Walter Benjamin and Hannah Arendt in relation to Margarete Susman is a very interesting question. It is remarkable that these three notable Jewish, very smart German Jewish thinkers and critics lived and acted in the same period and in the same space to some extent. Benjamin and Arendt were younger than Margarete Susman. In the case of Hannah Arendt, we have not found any trace of acknowledgement of the work of Margarete Susman until now, which is odd in a way. In the case of Walter Benjamin, I find them more and more. So there are traces and overlaps, and And this is not surprising because both thinkers were preoccupied with the same issues and topics. To name but a few: German Romanticism, Goethe, anarchism, time, history, revolution, Kafka, Stefan George, Jewishness, in the case of Margarete much more than Walter Benjamin, Germanness. All these questions, they addressed both of them, and they did not in parallel worlds. I've come to realize that increasingly. Okay, so the structure of my presentation largely follows the structure of the edition. So my talk will be a little more episodic than comprehensive. And then I will focus, in the second half of my talk, I will focus especially on questions related to Judaism and Jewishness. Okay. So during a large part of her time, Susman had a high reputation as an engaged critical thinker among her contemporaries. Witness the index of names to the edition, which comprises more than 30 pages. Witness also the enormous amount of letters in the archives. There is a bit of a tragic situation about her estate after her death, but that is not for the record. Well, not in detail. But there is an enormous amount of archival, there is, some got lost, but there is an enormous amount of letters from her archive. And that accounts for, shows some of the network she had. But Margarete Susman history is also one of an extinguishing intellectual presence. When her memories, and they were called Ich habe viele Leben gelebt, I lived many lives, when her memories were published in 1964, so she was already 92 at that age, there was an astonishing public echo across all German-speaking and Germany-oriented press, and I found reviews from Argentinian newspapers, from Californian newspapers, from Turkish newspapers. So it was an enormous response. She also received a Festschrift at her 90th birthday, to which important people contributed. She became a doctor honoris causa at the Free University in Berlin in the 1950s. So there was an acknowledgement, was formal acknowledgement. But at the same time, her intellectual presence disappeared quickly in the late 1950s, and she was acknowledged by ever fewer voices. One of these voices that acknowledged her was the poet Paul Celan. And Paul Celan wrote to her in June 1963, first in German, Was Sie geschrieben haben und noch schreiben, zählt für mich zu jenen einmaligen Begegnungen, aus denen man lebt. What you have written and are still writing, I count among the unique encounters that make living worthwhile. Now, in case of women writers or thinkers, biographies usually trigger more fascination than their thoughts. This is something which Susman resisted against in general. When she worked on the edition of some of the work of cultural philosopher Georg Simmel in the 1950s, she was highly irritated that the introduction included aspects of Georg Simmel's private life. In a letter to philosopher Michael Landmann, who obviously complained about her corrections in their mutual introduction, she says, yes, I crossed out so much because it did not deal with Simmel, but with other people. I do not think that his wife should be mentioned. And also, what Dilthey did to Simmel, it's not important for his image. Her entire professional life, Susman was self-employed and lived from her writings and from the many lectures she gave in major German and Swiss cities, which were usually held, we know that from witnessings and reviews, they were lectures that were usually held for large crowds. But nonetheless, it was a precarious existence, not only financially, but it also tired her out. In March 1923, she writes to a friend, I held my first lecture on Goethe in the Kunstgesellschaft in Frankfurt, and it was such a huge success that they want to hear it again in an even bigger circle. Also, the radio asked for yet another lecture on Goethe. I'm quite tired these days, and this rapid way of working has exhausted me. Of course, it kept her in close contact with the great spectrum of journalistic and different periodical press and the publishing market of her time, and it allowed her to pursue her acute observations of the time. Though in her letters, it also becomes obvious that she really wanted to make comprehensive studies, but so there's a scholar also in her, but she was often hindered by short-term engagements. Susman's writing career spans 60 years. It includes 18 books, more than 200 essays and articles. Particularly, her books are unevenly divided. 2 monographs appeared before the First World War, 1 appeared in the Weimar Republic, and then 7 after 1945. An important aspect related to her books is that, now that I come to think about it more often, is you can see in her monographs or in her books that they were conceived as on the basis of an essay-like structure that was then compiled into one flowing texts, but you can still see the different parts of the thinking. So I think it characterizes her thinking, but also it relates to her situation in life. So the monographies with a kind of slightly fragmented structure still. Looking back at her life at the age of 94 in her memories, she points out the deep historical rifts that marked her life and thinking. She calls it Risse durch die Welt, cracks in the world, right? That's how she looks at her life and how it was structured. One of such cracks, Risse, is a small anecdote from her early childhood, which caused a major shock to her and her sense of being. She recounts in her child memories how she had celebrated Christmas with her parents in a beautifully illuminated dining room. So the family lived in Hamburg at that time. Then the parents returned to dine, and the 2 children were left with their German nanny. The German nanny started telling Christmas stories about Jews and Christians, and she recounts, and I'm quoting Susman, "The word Christian appeared so much more beautiful than Jew in the glow of that evening, and I wanted to be a Christian. I will never forget the reply that girl flung at me. That is impossible. We are Christians, you are Jews." Fixed as if they were carved in stone, these few words have been stuck in my memory ever since, she says. Of course, fundamental cracks are the First World War and its aftermath of failed revolutions, and then what is very important in her thinking, the inflation that dehumanized people. And for Margarete Susman, it is the experience of the inflation that is the breeding ground for National Socialism. The nihilistic forces of nationalism that promised to fill out the emptiness of the community that was felt in a country that felt humiliated. What struck her also, the powerlessness of the German intellectuals, their lack of political insight and engagement. The rise of National Socialism made her leave Germany in 1933, never to return there again. The destruction of European Jewry, which she addressed as early as 1946. Living in exile in Zurich for 30 years, she looked at the destruction and the umpteenth attempt to rebuild civilization, now accompanied by a strong process of oblivion. So let me, for the remainder of the time, turn more concrete to some of Susman's work. And as said, I want to follow the structure of the edition as we conceive it and then highlight her thinking on Judaism. The first 2 volumes of the Gesammelte Schriften contain some 130 of her more than 200, as he called it, short texts, articles and essays. We clustered them in 3 parts, and we kept finding these isolated texts and these different texts in all possible journals and magazines. And how do you deal with it? What do you do? Do you make a chronology? Do you just put the texts how they came into being, but then you come with articles and then you have a monography and then articles again? So we clustered the articles in the first 2 parts and we made a structure out of them. We called it 3 parts. The articles so bundled in the first two volumes, and we clustered them in 3 parts called Gestalten, figures, Gedankenkreise, circles of thought, and Gespräche mit Büchern, conversations with books. These titles capture her reasoning and mode of thinking. Her texts are portraits, essays, reviews that were published in a great many journals and newspapers. Her reviews are never just reviews, as I mentioned before, in which she merely tries to grasp the objective meaning of a book. Instead, she strives to grasp its core, the center around which everything was written. It was the Jewish philosopher and theologist Franz Rosenzweig who understood her way of thinking when he asked her explicitly to write a review of his own opus magnum, Stern der Erlösung, the Star of Redemption, published in 1922. He wrote to her, "The motto that you chose for your essay, with it, you have pronounced the secret of the book without profaning it." The motto she used, Margarete Susman, for the review of Rosenzweig's Stern der Erlösung is the following, in German and then in English. And it's a quote from, it's a motto, a quote that she uses at the top of her review that comes from Rosenzweig's Werk himself. Denn wahrhaftig, Name ist nicht, wie der Unglaube immer wieder wahrhaben möchte, Schall und Rauch, sondern Wort und Feuer. Den Namen gilt es zu nennen und zu bekennen, ich glaub ihn. So in English, for truly, name is not, as unbelief would like to admit again and again, sound and smoke. It is word and fire. The name is to be named and confessed I believe him. Franz Rosenzweig was one of the renewers of Judaism and Jewish faith, to which he returned himself when he was on the verge of a conversion to Protestantism after something that he called an epiphanic experience. In his book, The Star of Redemption, he deals with the relationship between God, humanity, and the world, which are connected by creation, revelation, and redemption. Thinking real life, man in the world created by God. Rosenzweig, who had been a trained Hegel scholar, but also turned his back on this only metaphysical or abstract look of philosophy, Rosenzweig underscores the idea also to love God, and to do so is to return to the world, and that is what he calls redemption. Susman, who was acquainted with various prominent figures of the rejuvenation of Judaism, most of all Martin Buber and his return to Hasidic movement and the Shekinah, she acknowledges Rosenzweig's ideas and most of all his language. At the end of her review, she states, and more specific than what she says about Rosenzweig is what she says about reviewing things. She says, "It is impossible, and it makes no sense to criticize this book that has brought to words elements that precede the world and that are the light of the world beyond. Such a criticism would be nothing but a repetition of one's own assumptions. It is not a scientific hypothesis that can be proven or rejected. This rich and fleeting work needs to be accepted beyond provability." In the same vein, Susman takes up the defense of Martin Buber's and Franz Rosenzweig's new translation of the Jewish Bible several years later, which they had undertaken in the same spirit of the renewal of a religious sense, for which they sought a new German language that was released from the Luther Protestant Bible translation. Rosenzweig and Buber's translation was a controversial enterprise that triggered some serious critique. Susman defended, at least she sought again, as she always did, to understand what Buber and Rosenzweig were doing. Younger contemporaries, such as Siegfried Kracauer, crushed this Bible translation and called it a new romantic esoteric experiment that led to nothing. They did criticize this work in public reviews, such as in the Frankfurter Zeitung, and that became for Susman something like a public execution. She broke off all her relationship with Kracauer for the rest of her life. Also, her portraits, most of which were devoted to contemporaries, are conceived in this manner. She never judged, never aburteilen, as Walter Benjamin loved doing at times. She reveals herself as a conversation partner to thinkers who put their questions to the world. Some of them, as I said, well known today, others forgotten. Lukács, Martin Buber, Ernst Bloch, Leo Beck, Gustav Landauer, Sigmund Freud, Henry Bergson, Bernhard Gruthuysen, Bertha Pappenheim, Tolstoy, also Dostoevsky, Schopenhauer, Marx, Kierkegaard, and others that have totally disappeared on the lower shelves of the libraries. They were all writers. The third essayistic form, which we've called Gedankenkreise, address networks of questions. The Jews and the German Revolution, women in the modern world, the exodus out of philosophy, and then a major text, I think one of the most important of things she written. It's called Die geistigen Tragkräfte des modernen Kollektivismus, the spiritual supporting powers of modern collectivism. These Gedankenkreise essays are singular studies that comprise some 20 to 40 pages. It was the genre that Susman practiced most during the First World War and the Weimar Republic. These profound and critical essays of the period are, I think, key for any attempt to grasp the intellectual span of German and European culture at that time. During exile, which started in 1933, this mode of production collapsed. Swiss media were different, but most of all, she was very often ill and found herself overwhelmed by the horror of everything that happened. From a Swiss sanatorium, she wrote to Erich von Kahler in July 1937, "These last 2 years should have been the time of my harvest. Everything was ready. I felt so alert, so free. And then these senseless acts of fate undermined everything. Or was there a law in it after all?" The idea of the law is a key concept in her thinking about Judaism. But the idea of the law does not imply any intellectual fatalism. In 1939, she wrote this essay, which I just mentioned, Die geistigen Tragkräfte des modernen Kollektivismus, the spiritual supporting powers of modern collectivism, in which she evokes a world of nothingness, lawlessness, and without any human connection, a world in which fascism can set itself up as the savior of the emptiness. Susman does not look at cheap Nazi propaganda. This is not the spiritual supporting power. She looks at the writing of quite different, very smart people. Benito Mussolini, Ernst Jünger, Heidegger. She looks at their nihilism, at the affirmation of their nothingness. She closes with a small consolation referring to the second book of Moses, quote, "Whenever you find a man's footprint, God is ahead of you." Susman's career as a writer started with a review of a book called Vom Ghetto zur modernen Kultur, a book written by German-Jewish Polish translator and scholar Jakob Frommer. It appeared in 1906, Vom Ghetto zur modernen Kultur. Her first review ever published in the Frankfurter Zeitung. While it appears a little odd that she chose this topic for her first review ever, not in the least because she'd been given a position in the Frankfurter Zeitung as a reviewer of modern poetry, in hindsight, and she made her name as a reviewer of modern poetry, so why did she choose this book for her first review? In hindsight, it is significant. Before she addressed Judaism in a consistent and committed way, which is only a few years later, already this review reveals her strong skepticism towards a form of emancipation or a so-called modernization that consisted in turning away from Jewish religion and its life in community structured by the laws. I will come back to that theme immediately, but I want to sketch her work a little broader first. Her last publication, her very final publication, was a review of the Festschrift für Ernst Bloch by Siegfried Unsfeld, published in 1966, a week after her death. The range of newspapers and journals in which Susman published her essays illustrates historical culture and its abrupt changes. So you see a media landscape also changing. It's not only her text, it's also the media in which she published her. The Frankfurter Zeitung, with its pluralist attitude, well-read and also well-paying, was important for her until 1932-33. It wasn't a fixed position, but she was a regular contributor, and this was a position with the Frankfurter Zeitung that she was envied for by many younger generation, also other writers. But from the correspondence we found in the archives she had with the editorial office of the Frankfurter Zeitung, we also learned to know something about a willful character. Striking, she insists on reviewing books that had not appeared on the list of the Frankfurter Zeitung. And the editors write to her, it happens more than once, that she expresses too much of a political opinion in her reviews. One example was a review she wrote for Gustav Landauer's 1919 edition, Briefe aus der Französischen Revolution. So Gustav Landauer was a revolutionary, and I'm going to talk a little later about him, who published a historical collection of letters from the French Revolution, and she reviewed it. But she, as usual, she made a big review and expressed also ideas about the time. And it was considered too political, and the Frankfurter dragged its feet and didn't want to publish it, and then there had to be mediation and diplomacy. And then the same happened with her essay, Der Exodus aus der Philosophie, 1921. It's an essay on Simmel, Scheele, Keyserling, Spengler, Bloch, Rosenzweig, and Rosenstock. All these were considered too opinionated and too political. So what happened after a long correspondence often is that, to her dismay, she saw that the articles she had written were printed but had been re-edited and shortened. Next to the Frankfurter Zeitung, which then was assimilated in the 1930s, in Switzerland, Neue Zürcher Zeitung was another major newspaper in which she published. After the First World War, she published in a lot of revolutionary, progressive periodicals, Die Masken, Das Flugblatt, Das Tribunal, which did not last long. And what is important also, not in the least, of course, related to the topic of Judaism, is that she, in the decade after the First World War, she contributed to many of the important German Jewish periodicals that had come into being during and after the war. These periodicals was the result of, to put it somewhat simplified, the blaze of anti-Semitism that had appeared in Germany during the First World War. They were rooted, of course, in the experience of the war, and they were related to the search of spiritual generation, typical of the time, and in this case, true Judaism. For example, Der Jude, founded by Martin Buber, Der Morgen by Julius Goldstein, Blätter des Jüdischen Frauenbundes. It was a life of public writing in a cultural political world that collapsed in the 1930s. This changed in Switzerland, where she had a precarious status of a refugee and initially published under a pseudonym. The socialist-oriented newspaper Der Aufbau offered possibilities, and as well as the religious progressive periodical Neue Wege, edited by Leonhard Ragaz. But the bridges to the German world of newspapers remained broken after 1945, and her publicity profile changed and had to change. And then she took upon her the production of her many books, her many monographs, which were, as I mentioned, based on her what she called smaller work, and was profoundly intertwined with them. The first monograph Susman wrote is a study of the nature of lyrical poetry, and it was published in 1910, called Das Wesen der modernen deutschen Lyrik, and it was based on the many reviews on contemporary poetry Susman had written for the Frankfurter Zeitung. The production of poetry in Germany before the First World War is really a remarkable phenomenon, so there was a lot to review, and she did that extensively. From the perspective of poetry studies today, Susman's book is remarkable. It offers one of the first systematic theoretical reflections on poetry as a linguistic artifact, in which not the poet's voice, not the subjective character of the poet, is represented and needs to be traced by the reader. She insists that the essence of the poem lies in its specific language and the rhythm, and that makes up its cultural and social historical performativity. The meaning of poetry she explores in this book is well summarized in a single-page essay that she wrote later at the occasion for Martin Buber's 50th birthday. In this one-page essay, she rehearses the fundamental conception of poetry as the art of the word, and she says, "Argumentation is what analyzes matter, describes it, states it, speaks about it, comes after life, in which it is fossilized into pastness. The word itself is the body of things, which it witnesses. It is actual life. The argument is construction of words under the aegis of logic. Words become word only when they shape themselves by their own law, the law of the living embodied present, when instead of the logically managed argument they become, in the original living order of the rhythm, poetry, poem, song, and prayer." Susman, by the way, does not do any hermeneutics. It is not an exercise in understanding or interpretation. What she does is a formal and philosophical analysis that underscores the meaning of the lyrical as a form of art. The same importance, the meaning she attributes to a literary text that is able to grasp the state of the world through its language reappears in her many writings on literature, also now in her most well-known essay on Kafka. Susman continued her philosophical approach towards modernity in a more abstract mode than she did in her book on poetry, in a book she published in 1912, and it's called Vom Sinn der Liebe. Vom Sinn der Liebe, the meaning of love. She touched the nerve of the time with a book on the metaphysical nature of love that transcends the modern individual. Love doesn't not transcending the modern individual, not in the sense to merge with another individual and then form an isolated duality, but interestingly, love with a view on the human community. Love is the only human force that has the potential to cut across the routine, the provisional, the fleeting, the petty, the mortal. This book got an amazing amount of reviews across, again, the entire political spectrum, from left to right. Among them, Gustav Landauer, the utopian anarchist and revolutionary, Robert Musil, Ellen Key. And what is remarkable when you look at the reviews is that time and again, these reviewers quote the last sentence of the book, in which Susman evokes man's destiny towards love in a fairly poetical language. In German, love as des gemeinsamen Schlummerns und Erwachensollens unter dem Sternenhimmel der Ewigkeit. Slumbering and awakening together under the starry sky of eternity. The word ewig, eternity, it is also the final word of Gustav Mahler's symphony on the songs of the earth, which had been performed only a few months before the publication of Susman's book that same year. In 1946, Susman published das Buch Hiob oder das Schicksal des jüdischen Volkes, the Book of Job or the Fate of the Jewish People, one of the first reflections on the destruction of European Jewry. Susman called it the book that contains my entire life. It brings, in fact, together all she had written on Judaism and the Jewish people before the Shoah. So it's a compilation of many thoughts she'd developed in the course of the time. From her early writings on, the story of the book of Job was an important source of inspiration. In her first, what she calls herself, Jewish essay, as she once said, so it's an essay on Spinoza, there are traces already of her reading of the book of Job to be found. Her essay on Kafka, in which she reads Der Prozess, the novel Der Prozess, as a modern book of Job, this reference is made very explicit. Job is a leitmotif in Susman's thinking on Judaism. For Susman, the book of Job is the most important part of the Hebrew Bible, and the figure of Job and his fight or trial by and with God, der Hader mit Gott, as she says in her Kafka analysis, is a symbol of Jewishness. Greek tragedies work through their notion of fate and its relation to the divine. The book of Job stages the fundamental relation of Jews to their God, the absolute just and righteous, whose law permeates every aspect of creation and human life. Job is nothing but a human being, alone in the world, and far away from him, God, who sends him his fate, which Job has to accept as a creature of divine creation. He has no guilt, and he knows he has no guilt. His questions of justice, which he asks God, are not answered. His fate, however, remains. Ich weiß, dass mein Rächer lebt, mein Löser, mein Erlöser lebt. I know that my avenger lives, my healer, my redeemer. And I quote from her book, the book of Job. The fate of the Jewish people is revealed most clearly in the life of Job. So this is Susman. As in Job's life, the life of Israel begins under the great shining, and over its house stands God's mystery that singles it out and encloses it, and that is the inconceivable promise to Abraham. In thee and in thy seed shall all the families of the earth be blessed. This is the bond of God with Israel, in which it is forever secured. End of quote. This is the unique situation of the Jewish people, its bond with God, that has never been torn in spite of 2,000 years of exile and hardship, and of which also the most detached Jew, Susman says, is still aware of it through his descent. If a Jew loses his faith, he loses himself. In a modern world from which God has disappeared for both Christians and Jews, the Jew says, Margarete Susman says, the Jew has suffered a double loss and alienation because for him there is no historical messianic memory, only the hope of redemption, and if the idea of redemption disappears, so does the hope. The loss of divine law implies a total loss, which is beyond the fate of Job, whose suffering never caused him to lose his God or his belief in divine justice. But Susman says in a 1946 book, what now? After a destruction for which there is no expression. So what she does at the end of her book is she, like Job's return to life after his ordeal, the question Susman asks is, what will the Jewish people do after, quote, millions of defenseless people have been slaughtered? Will they represent life in a world of death, in the light of messianic fate? Will they continue their truly ethical mode of life that has lasted thousands of years? She ends the book of Job with a long quote from the diaries of Franz Kafka, who of all people, she says, gave up on his Jewish world, but who at the same time points out in his fiction what this giving up of the world means, of the divine means. In his own sober language, he spoke, she says, the eternal but after all, das dennoch, of the redemption of the world. And from this diary she quotes, so this is Kafka being quoted in Susman, there is no denial of the foreboding of a final liberation. So Kafka uses the word Befreiung, not Erlösung. There is no denial of the foreboding of the final liberation when the imprisonment has not changed the next day or even gets worse, or even when it is said explicitly that the imprisonment will never stop. All this can possibly be the precondition of the final liberation. End of quote. This most existential of Jewish feelings, hope, is what Kafka expresses, Susman says. Susman herself concludes her book, final sentence of the book of Job. We who know so much, we know nothing. We do not know what matters for us only. We do not know about the plan of which we are part and from which we live. But this is why we also do not know whether this dark world that has drifted so far from redemption is not close to redemption. The book was well read, but very controversial. While some readers were moved to tears, they said, others reacted with more skepsis. Her friend and philosopher Edith Landmann wrote to her, quote, Liebe Susa, if I were a politician, I would have to fight your book. It seems to teach that the Jewish people has wanted this fate of the Galut. But I would tell them to shake off this desperate metaphysical interpretation of misfortune. Susman replied to Landmann in a very long letter. Unfortunately, that got lost, and we only got Edith Landmann's reply, who said, thank you very much for your explanation. But we don't know what she answered. The journalist Stefan Ripplinger, whom I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, points out, I think rightly so, that Susman's book is not a theodicy, nor is it about guilt. It should be read in the sense of the Teshuvah. If you give up God, and thus give up everything, you make a pact with the empire of injustice, horror, and cruelty. This book is the only book that was still edited after everything else disappeared, and it has overshadowed a bit the whole specter of her writing. Now, the Jewish people, with their ahistorical fate and their ethics based on divine law amidst of the lawlessness of world history, functions in Susman's thinking as a metonymy. So the Jewish people in Susman's thinking throughout her texts are a metonymy, a pars pro toto of the ultimate humanness. Thus it is not to wonder entirely that Susman feared the idea of the founding of a new state after the total destruction of European Jewry. She was afraid of the idea that Jews would become involved in the very practice of world politics in which nationalism had been the greatest evil she had witnessed. In her 1919 essay, so long before that, Die Revolution und die Juden, this is expressed most clearly. She wrote this review, Die Revolution und die Juden. It was written after the hope of a socialist revolution in Germany had been crushed with great violence. She wrote it after her friend, the utopian political thinker, Gustav Landauer, had been murdered brutally in Munich. In her essay, she considers the large number of German Jewish revolutionaries that were involved in this striving for a new society at that time. This, she argues, is inspired by the Jewish sense of responsibility for life, the idea of a spiritual community rather than as a historical nation state. In her earliest, as I said, Jewish writing, or as she called it herself, from 1913, apart from the review of Jacob Frommer's book, so in her earliest Jewish writing from 1913, which was about the 17th century philosopher Spinoza, and it was called Spinoza und das jüdische Weltgefühl, Susman already sets out what she considers the core element of Jewishness and Judaism, which is strange in the case of a historical philosopher who broke with the Sephardic community in which he had been raised. So Spinoza, who fled the Jewish community in Amsterdam because of many things that displeased him there, this person she links to the jüdische Weltgefühl. Spinoza, the thinker of immanence and metaphysical purist. His philosophy, Susman argues, is rooted in the metaphysical home of Judaism. Content-wise, as far as the content is concerned, his philosophy, of course, cannot be compared to the world of the Jewish faith. But the religious spirit that propels his thinking, his great conviction that God is everything, which we can never imagine in the slightest, and which must remain invisible, gives him the greatest certainty of the coherence of everything, including the smallness of man. This is nourished by his Jewish consciousness of God, and so is his love of God, that does not strive for some mystic unification in a Christian sense, but rather searches for God's law in himself. And it contains, she says, die unendliche Sehnsucht nach dem vollkommenen Begreifen des Gesetzes. So this longing for the full understanding of the law. Jewishness is also traced in the various writings on Rahel Varnhagen, the 18th century Salonier and writer, Rahel Varnhagen, who is compared to Spinoza in that same Jewish spirit they both inherited. Now, one could not think of a greater difference between two historical personalities. Rahel Varnhagen, or Rahel Levin Varnhagen, early 19th century writer, she was a Berlin Saloniere. She wrote letters. She was open to everything and everybody in the world and reacted very effectively to everything she encountered. She was a thinker, as Susman writes, who was alien to every system and every form of systematization of knowledge. And thus Rahel never had created an oeuvre in the classical sense of the word. And then this woman is compared to Spinoza and his extremely logical mode of thinking. Yet both, Susman argues, are propelled by a messianic view of the world, in which suffering always contains a grain of happiness, and suffering should not simply be overcome in some pathetic way, but is acknowledged and welcomed as a power of truth. It is interesting to note that in this context, that in Susman's most successful work, Frauen der Romantik, which was first published in 1929, so the women of Romanticism, Rahel, the same figure, is not so much presented as a Jewish character. She is a problematic figure, problematische Gestalt, but it has to do with her androgen character, so male-female combination. She calls her a Frau mit einer starken Anlage, ein männlich-schöpferischer Geist, a male creative spirit. Appropriate would have been the creation of a great theoretical work by Rahel Varnhagen, but that was impossible around 1800. Susman concludes, nonetheless, that Rahel Levin for the first time, Susman reads Rahel Levin for the first time as a true intellectual, a thinker in her own right, a complete great system of thoughts like veins of gold embedded in primary rocks. And important also is her conclusion about German Romanticism when she says it is in fact a failure. German Romanticism is a failure. It has nothing, it has materialized nothing in this world. It has played with the highest metaphysical thought. It had flirted with everything in the world, universal, but in the end it was a political failure. Martin Buber, Hermann Cohen, Bertha Pappenheim, Freud, Wolfskehl, Bergson, many thinkers and activists rooted in and inspired by their Jewish descent, Susman deals with, analyzes and adds to her work on European modernity, where they were thoroughly and profoundly belong. The same happens to her book on Georg Simmel. So in the 1950s, she wrote a book for the Leo Baeck Institute on Georg Simmel. And although Simmel was an assimilated Jew, and Gershom Scholem is very negative about this, the figure of Georg Simmel, because he's such is the epitome of assimilation in Germany. Nonetheless, so while Scholem considered Simmel as the embodiment of the assimilated Jew, Susman underscores Simmel's Jewish descent for some of the key aspects in his work, his theory of the stranger, most of all his concept of the third between material life and metaphysics, which reveals, quote Susman, most clearly an element that lived somewhat hidden in Simmel's philosophy, yet without which it could never have been possible, the messianic, which every real Jew carries within himself. I come to the end. Let me return at the end of my paper to the autobiography. Ich habe viele Leben gelebt, Erinnerungen, published in 1964. I mentioned it already. It was her last book. It was the book she could not write, because in the last years of her life she was blind. The Leo Baeck Institute in New York asked her to write an autobiography because they had started up a series of autobiographies to get witnesses and testimonies of the German Jewish culture that had disappeared. So she was also asked to write a biography, and she even got a fellowship so that she could hire someone who would type what she had been dictating. It was an extremely difficult book, and it took a long time to produce. Max Kreuzberger, then director of the Leo Baeck Institute, his patience was put to the test. If you read their correspondence, you can see what a long and painful process it is. Over the ocean back and forth, typed manuscripts that were corrected and then were lost. And anyway, this book came to be. In her Vorbemerkung, prologue, Susman asks her audience to read the book with Nachsicht, with leniency, and she concludes, in fact, language of old age is silence. That the autobiography in this mode and tone, there was no anger, no bitterness, was so praised, makes one a little skeptical. Indeed, if you look at the reviews that were printed everywhere, it was actually, for many, it was an act of forgiveness for all the crimes committed against Jews. Someone had said, oh, let's rest in peace, and now everything could then continue. Now it was in the open, and history could go on. Someone had given a blessing that was not given. The book, it was a spark of firework, and then there was darkness, and Susman and her work were largely forgotten. Thank you.